Good morning, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about nonfiction book proposals. I figured now might be a good time to talk about this because I am just about to start working on my nonfiction book proposal for the Taylor Swift and Mythology book. Over the last few projects that I've done, I have not recorded or chatted about really my book proposals to that deep of an extent. I think I've mentioned it here or there if it is something I'm working on and I'm filming that day, but I typically tried not to say anything because in case the project didn't go anywhere, I didn't really want to be advertising it. There's no getting around that for the Taylor Swift project. I've been talking about it extensively everywhere. So I thought that now might be a good time to actually talk about nonfiction book proposals and what they entail and why we have them and how to make one. There is a lot of information and resources available for fiction writers putting together querying packages. There are some resources for nonfiction book writers, but not that many. And so I hope that this might be of use to somebody who is needing some resources and discussions and advice and thoughts on the matter. Or maybe if you're a fiction writer and you just want to know a little bit more about what the other half is doing. What's the other side of publishing looking like? What is it dealing with? What kind of stuff are they having to do? So regardless of the reason why you're here, let's get into it. So the structure of today is going to be that we're going to start with a little bit of why nonfiction book proposals exist and what they are actually doing, what kind of purpose they are serving. Then we're going to get into each section of the book proposal. I'm going to have chapters down below, so if you need a little bit more information or guidance or you want to review this later and jump to whatever section you are working on, then hopefully that is of use to you. Before we get into it, two things. One, I'm going to discuss my credentials and why I know a bit about this. And two, I'm going to have a little bit of like a caveat asterisk between everything that we are going to be talking about. So if you are new around here, I'm Vivian Asimos. I'm a researcher and a writer, and I have published 4 nonfiction books. 3 of these were traditionally published, and so all 3 of them required a book proposal in order for me to publish them. So I do have some experience with successful book proposals. I also have some experience with not as successful book proposals, though these were for a variety of different reasons that I will try to signpost when I come to the relevant topic. Now, as I said, there is a big asterisk with all of the things that I'm going to be talking about today, which is to say, typically. Everything is atypically. When we talk about publishing in general, whether it's fiction or it's nonfiction, everything has an outlier. There is always an exception to the rule. There is always somebody that did not have to write the whole book first for their fiction novel. There is somebody who was able to get a massive book deal on their very first deal. There is somebody who got signed without having to do an agent for some big publisher. There is always an example of somebody who did not necessarily need to follow the typical script that most other writers have to follow. Also, there are going to be publishers that require different things in their proposal. Maybe they don't list something that I'm going to list. Maybe somebody does list it and there's only 1 or 2 that you find. A lot of this is going to be dependent on what publishers you reach out to, what agents you reach out to, and what kind of nonfiction you are writing, because nonfiction is very big, right? There's all sorts of different types of nonfiction, and therefore there's a lot of different ways that things can be approached. I am trying to do a little bit of a catch-all here of what most nonfiction requires. These are the things that are typically required of you. So before you sound off in the comments of, well, actually, I didn't have to, or, well, actually, this was something that somebody had to do, I'm sure that's the case, and I'm sure that it is well documented, and I'm sure that there might be even more than one example of this. But I'm talking about for 99% of the writers who are putting together book proposals, these are the kinds of things that they're going to need to do, and they are probably going to have to write a book proposal. So for you guys, this is what this is. So first, we're going to talk about what a book proposal is and why you need one. A book proposal is kind of what it sounds like on the tin. You are writing up a proposal for a book that you have not written yet. Now, that is a very key point for nonfiction writing. You typically, right? You typically have not written the whole book yet. There is a couple of really important reasons as to why you typically do not write a nonfiction book before you actually get your deal of whatever sort. Nonfiction tends to, typically, depending on the type of nonfiction you are talking about, it tends to require a lot of research. It tends to require a lot of time. Cookbooks require research and time and energy, and so do biographies, and so do general nonfiction for anthropology of popular culture, which is what I do. These are all things that require time, energy, and research in order to produce. And so if you put in a whole lot of time, energy, and research into a particular topic, and then a publisher says, well, we wouldn't mind this small change, but that small change in the proposal ends up equaling a huge change in the research process, then that's going to be ridiculously hard and time consuming to change. So it's easier to change it at that beginning stage when you haven't done all of that yet, before you set up stage into everything else. So it's easier to make all those changes at the proposal stage when you're still just talking about the book before you've actually written the book. So I have a really good example of this. When I did Cosplay and the Dressing of Identity, my proposal was initially that I was going to be only looking at cosplay in the UK. I was coming from an academic background. That kind of really specified scope is normally the kind of thing that is required in academic research. However, for general nonfiction, a lot of people want to see themselves in it. They want to be able to reach certain markets. So my publisher said, actually, we would really love for the US to be included in this, not just the UK. That was a really easy change. I had to just change some small things in the proposal, change a little bit about my research strategy, and then that was it. If I were to have already done all of the research, it would have been a lot more difficult to slot in the US research that I did without it sounding out of place, without it sounding like something that I had to stitch in after the fact. Not to mention that I would have had to go and do all of that research after I had already done a load of research. So it was much easier to make that change at that point in order to make the book that ended up being at the other end. It was a very easy change, a very simple change, which would have been way more of a problem to do if I had already written the book. So overall, the proposal has to answer 3 very specific questions. These 3 questions should also be answered throughout almost every single section of your proposal. So these are really important questions to be asking yourself before you sit down to do anything for this book. What are you writing about? Why is it so important? And why should you be the one to write it? So the first one, what are you writing about? This should be relatively obvious. If this is not obvious to you, then you need to do some thinking beforehand. Now, this obviously is the topic. So let's use my Cosplay and the Dressing of Identity book as our example case, just because, why not? But basically, so what am I writing about? Well, I could say, I'm writing about cosplay. It's about cosplay. Okay, well, there's a lot of different things and types of books that can be about cosplay. Is it a how-to book about cosplay? Is it descriptions of cosplay? Is it like a photo book? I did an anthropology of cosplay. So it's a general nonfiction book that is an anthropology of cosplay. Cool. Already starting to put down boundaries of what it is that I'm writing about. I also had a scope, right? Cosplay is global. People are doing it everywhere in the world. That is huge to try to think about. So instead, I narrowed it down to the UK because that is where I live. And then my publisher asked me to extend it to the US. So my scope became the UK, US, cosplayers, anthropology of them. Why does it matter? Why do people do this? I'm digging into those questions. Why do people partake in cosplay? Why do people find it an important hobby or aspect of their life? What does all this mean? What's going on here? That's what I'm asking. That's what I'm talking about. And my kind of thesis statement is that cosplay is a form of mythic play, mythic performance, and people are able to deeply connect to the fiction that means something really important to them through this act. Bam. That's my thesis. That's my point. That's what I'm writing about. So in order to ask this question, you need to think about all sorts of different things. It's not just the general topic, because obviously, I'm sure you already have that, but think about things like the scope, right? Are you looking at this, thing globally or through a particular dimension of time? If it's historical, are you doing the entire history of England, or are you only looking at the Reformation? Are you looking at all of the UK, or are you only looking at England, right? So these are the different ways that you can kind of narrow down your scope. What kind of topics are you thinking about touching on? These are things that you can mention in your overview as examples. What kind of stuff are you going to be discussing? What kind of things are on the table? What kind of things are off the table? And then, of course, you should be thinking about the primary question of your thesis. What is it all coming down to? What is the main argument of your book? So, question number 2, why does it matter? This is a question that I used to really hate when I was in academia, because it was asked a lot, particularly on grant applications and other, funding forms and stuff like that. And I used to get really mad because it was like, oh, but it's fun and it's interesting, and shouldn't we just be pursuing knowledge for knowledge's sake? Somebody is standing in a bookshop. They have their very hard-earned £10 or £20 that they are going to be buying a book with. Why should they pick up your book in order to spend that hard-earned cash on? Because, to be honest, that's what they're thinking about, unfortunately, is why does this matter? Why do I care? What is the enticing for me? Why does this impact my life? How does this change my views? Why would I go to my friend after I read this and go, oh my God, you have to read this book? Because the truth of the matter is, as much as I really hated being asked this question when I was in academia, I find myself asking this question when I read other people's work a lot, of like, oh my God, why do I care? Like, why does this matter? Who cares? And I think that there is space for it's just a bit of fun in nonfiction, but you kind of have to explain why that matters. Why is it important for us to be having these kinds of fun discussions in the nonfiction space? Because that's also a really worthy endeavor, but that's something that you need to also be asking. So yeah, think about that question of if someone says, oh my God, you have to read this book because... what are they going to be saying? Think about what kind of impact it has on people's lives. Is it going to make cooking a lot easier and faster? Is it going to change their perspective on a certain aspect in history? Is it going to broaden their minds to other ways of life in other areas of the world? Is it going to bring a new perspective on a really familiar topic? These are all things that are really important to ask yourself. And now, probably what might be a bit of a controversial question, why should you be the one to write it? The thing about nonfiction, right, is that nonfiction is very expert-led. This is kind of a huge aspect of the field in general. Typically, when a book is being sold as nonfiction, whether it is through an actual commercialized space or whether it is through word of mouth, who wrote it tends to come up, right? It's, oh, there was this really interesting book about trees. It was written by a biologist. Okay, cool. Right? It's not written by a self-help expert or a life coach about trees, right? Because then you'd be like, what does that have to do with anything? Why do they know anything about trees? Why should I listen to their opinion on trees? But if it's somebody who knows a lot about it or has a deep experience of it, then suddenly that becomes really interesting, right? Oh, I lost the feeling in my leg. So I had to adjust here. Ow. So yeah, sometimes this is going to be tied to your question of why it's important, right? If it's a new perspective on something, or, no one's written it from, your own perspective before, then the fact that you are the one writing it becomes really important. So the first section is an introduction and or overview. I have seen quite a few proposals that include both of these. Some of them only include one of these. So do kind of keep that in mind when you are looking. It's been about a 50-50 shot for me, but I've gone ahead and included both of them just in case, so that way you know what each one kind of entails. So I have seen the introduction being described as kind of a quick blurb. This should be very, very short. It should be a very kind of almost pitch, right? Like this is, you are on the elevator. What is it that you are saying? When someone asks, what's your book about? What are you doing? What are you saying? This blurb should include probably about 3 to 5 sentences, and it should answer all 3 of those questions. What are you writing about? Why is it important? And why are you the one to write it? The overview, in contrast, is a lot more detailed. So this goes into a little bit more of a detailed space of what it is that you're talking about. So if you think about the introduction as kind of your pitch and your kind of quick sentences, your overview is almost like your more detailed blurb. So you said, this is what my book's about. And then someone goes, oh, really? That sounds interesting. Like, tell me more about it. Your overview is the tell me more about it section of what you are doing. This section is where you are going to really hammer in those 3 questions. Now, again, those 3 questions should be answered in every single section that we are going to be talking about, but here is where they are incredibly prominent. If you are looking over what you have written and you are not really answering in full force, very obviously, these 3 questions, then you need to rewrite it. Because sometimes agents, publishers might not look even at the rest of your proposal. This is the first thing that they read on your proposal. Is it worth their time to keep going? And if you haven't convinced them that it's important and worth reading and that you are somebody that they should hire to do this, then they're not going to keep going. So this is a really important section of your proposal. All right, so introduction, short blurb thing, overview, much more longer description, detailed study. I think I've seen that the overview should be like 3 paragraphs, but that number has varied. I've seen a lot of different ones. I think my one for cosplay was like 2 kind of beefy paragraphs. I fit the introduction and the overview just on 1 page, but obviously the introduction was a lot shorter. And then the overview was just more detail of what the introduction was. I have seen, like I said, some people only want the introduction. They only want the blurb and the pitch and nothing else. They don't want the overview. Some people only want the overview. Some people want both. It's better to have both written and ready to go so you can just cater your proposal to what people are asking for. All right, now we get down to the book details. So this is, again, a really important aspect. You haven't written the book yet, right? So keep that in mind. You haven't written the book yet. So your publisher doesn't know what this looks like. What are you imagining in your head? Because they don't have a manuscript for it in front of them. So what is this? Is it a picture book? Is it a cookbook? Is it an encyclopedia? Is it a general nonfiction? Like, what are we looking at? Is it paper book? Is it like physical, or are you only thinking about ebooks because that's where the people are, that your audience is really only ebooks, so you only really have to publish an ebook. No one really wants a physical book of whatever it is that you're doing. So let's talk about the different sections in the book details bit. So we have the format. So as I said, is this primarily an ebook? Is it a physical book? Is it paperback? Is it hardback? How many pages is it, roughly, on an estimate? You're going to work this out by how many words it's going to be on an estimate. So you are going to need to have a word count, and you're going to need to have an estimated page length if it's going to be a physical book. If it's going to be an ebook or an audiobook, you will still need to include word count, but you probably won't need to include page count because that's going to depend on the reader. I know that it sounds really crazy to be talking about word count if you haven't written the book yet, but it is really important. This is why if you saw my previous vlog where I was working on the kind of basic structure of how I wanted to structure the Taylor Swift and Myth book, I was really worried about my word count. This is why, because word count is really important. And even though I hadn't written the book yet, and I don't even know if those sections are going to stay, I have to be as certain as I possibly can on what is being included, how I'm including it, and how long I'm talking about these topics for. So let's talk word count. Most nonfiction, again, asterisk, typically, most nonfiction is between 50,000 words and 85,000 words. Now, there are exceptions, as I said. My cosplay book was 65,000, roughly. It's probably ended up being about 70K by the time all of the front matter and bibliography and index and all of that was added. So it was probably about 65 to 70K. My book, Digital Mythology and the Internet's Monster, however, was closer to 95,000, and that got published. Granted, it was with an academic press, and those length of books are more common for academic presses, but it's not uncommon. You don't necessarily have to stay within that framework. Another good example. I showed this book at the time when I was doing the overview. I have quite a few of his books. This is Tom Holland. He is a writer of history. He's also a history scholar. He teaches at Oxford? Anyway, see? Told you, expert led. I cited who he was. Anyway, this is also, it's about 400 to 450 words or pages. So that's over 100,000 words, probably closer to about 130,000 words. So nonfiction books can be longer than the 85 typical requirement, because you have to think that this is general across the board. So it's including things like cookbook, it's including things like self-help books, which tend to be a bit shorter self-help books, I've noticed. It is going to depend on what specific type of nonfiction you are writing. Try not to get too hung up in it. However, length of words equals length of pages, which equals cost of publication. So it can impact whether or not a publisher would be interested in your work if it seems really expensive to print. Similar to the images. So in this section, you also want to talk about how many images you're planning on having in your book. Oh, I should put Millennium back. You might want to think about how many images you are having in your book, because again, this affects cost. However, it also can make it ease of reading / comprehension. So sometimes having a lot of images is useful and important for your book. So be honest. Don't just think about, well, what's easy and cheap to produce. Think about what matters for your book, because sometimes things can actually be altered again at that publishing back and forth stage. When I was talking to the publisher about the cosplay book, one of the other changes that they made to my proposal, other than the scope, was how many images I was going to include. I was thinking about how expensive images were. I thought I was going to be trying to sell this to someone who didn't really care that much about cosplay. So I said maybe like 15 images. They said do 45. In fact, I think they wanted a bit more. I think they wanted like 50 images. I think I ended up with like 45 to 48 somewhere in there images. And a lot of them were images that I gathered. So again, if I had done the research already, I wouldn't have had time to go and grab those pictures actively, knowing that I was going to be using them in the book, getting permissions from the cosplayers who I took photos of that they were fine with appearing in the book. Obviously, knowing all of this kind of stuff ahead of time is really important. And so don't skimp on images if it's really relevant to your work. And in retrospect, having a load of images in the cosplay book was super good and helpful and useful and nice, because people could actually see these people doing what they're doing because it's a visual art form anyway. So having those images was really important. Images, image amounts, word count, things like that. Those are all the things that you include in this section. This is also where you might mention any kind of interesting structure change. So for example, if you were going to do like an encyclopedia style, this is also the section where you're going to need to know your completion date. Yes, because you have not written the book. So they know you haven't written the book. They're not going to accept your proposal and say, cool, give it to us tomorrow. That is not what's going to be given to you. It is not going to be what is expected. If that is something that they are expecting, then you do not want to work with them. So what you are going to be doing here is writing out just what your completion date is. Sometimes you can be really specific. Sometimes you can be a lot more general. So I was more general in my proposal until I basically then had to put together an edited version of it with all of the changes that we agreed to. And in that, I put an actual date because it was a little bit closer to actual acceptance by the publisher. So I could say, this is actually what I'm talking about. But normally I would say something like a year from, signing or something like that. Maybe you need a year and a half. Maybe you need 3 years. Maybe you need 6 months. I don't know. I don't know your schedule. I don't know your work, but be really honest. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with your publisher, because this completion date will end up being in your contract. If you cannot abide by that date, that is a breach in contract and it becomes a legal thing. And that's not something that you want to deal with. So be honest. If you need to overshoot, like I think I can probably get it done in 9 months, give yourself a year, because you don't know what's going to come up in life. You don't know what's going to happen. It's better to send it to them early and then they're pleasantly surprised than to be behind and not make your deadline. So be incredibly honest with what your completion date is. And last in this section is going to be your table of contents. Yes, you need to put in your table of contents. It's just a really quick one, like how it would appear at the front of a book, although without page numbers, right? But it would just be, here's the structure. Here's what it looks like. Here is the entries or what the chapters are, what order those chapters are going to be in. So that way they can kind of get an idea of the structure of the book and how it is going to be laid out and organized. Our next section is the chapter breakdown. Now, our previous one on the table of contents was literally just a table of contents. This section is where we're going to get into way more detail. So this section of the chapter breakdowns, the chapter overviews of what is in each chapter, this is where you're going to put a chapter title and you're going to have a bit of a paragraph on what is in this chapter. What is the topics of this chapter? What are you covering? Why is this here? Right? Again, asking those 3 questions. What are you covering? Why does this matter? What is this contributing to the argument? Maybe if this is leading somewhere, maybe you're saying this is really important in order to make an argument later on about whatever. Maybe this is relevant in order to make sure that the reader knows about a particular concept before you move on, because that concept lays the groundwork for the entirety of the rest of your argument. Whatever it is, you need to explain why it exists. Why does this chapter exist? So, some stuff to include in these little paragraphs that you're going to be doing. I would suggest only about 1 paragraph for each chapter, because theoretically you'll be having quite a few of these. It's going to be quite beefy. Why, as I said, why does this chapter exist? Why is it here? What does this contribute to the overall argument or discussions or point of your book? It would be nice to include some little factoids, little anecdotes, some interesting facts that are going to be included in this chapter. This kind of gives a little bit of insight into more detail as to what it is. So say, for example, in my cosplay book, I have a chapter on myth. What myth is, what my definition of myth is. This is really important for the argument that this is mythic performance, right? Got to know what myth is. However, I could just say, well, I got to talk about myth in order to make the argument and then move on. Well, that sounds really dry. That's not very helpful. So instead, I included also like a little blurb. Okay, so a lot of people actually use myth colloquially in a particular way. And it's that idea of myth as being fiction or not real is actually tied to some really early definitions of myth that some academics used back in the day, and it is actually a big problem, and here's why it's a big problem. So that means that the people reading it know this is why it's here, and also this is a little bit of the kind of stuff that's going to be in this chapter. Basically, through this, as they read through each of your chapter breakdowns, the reader of your proposal should get a really good, clear idea of the entirety of your book. They should be able to see the argument that you are making, how it is laid out. They should be able to follow each step and also be swayed just as much as if they had read the whole book. Do not worry about spoilers. I honestly don't know if nonfiction has spoilers in the same way, but do not worry about them. Do not hide like, oh, this is a really good juicy detail, but I'm going to save it for when the book is published. Don't do that. Don't do that. Just put it in the proposal. Your reader in the bookshop is not reading your proposal, right? It's your publisher. It's your agent. It's whatever you are trying to do in order to get that book in that bookshop or wherever it's going to be. So in order to get it there, Tell them what you have. Tell them the juicy little fun factoids that you have. Don't save anything. Don't hold back anything. Obviously, don't make it way too lengthy, but if you have like a really good, important, juicy detail that you think is really amazing, use it. Use it. Don't worry about spoilers. All right, our next section is the author bio. This does what it says on the tin. This is your biography. Remember, one of the big questions is, why should you be the one to write this? This is where you can add in all the fluff. All of the fluff. What is it that makes you an expert? That's kind of what this bio should be more or less focused on. It should also be focused on your ability to write. If you have any, accolades or backings for this, courses you've taken, awards you've won, Substacks that you run, and how many people are subscribed to it. I don't know, man. Whatever it is that you can use as your example of I know how to write and people are interested in what my writing is, then use it. If you don't have that, that's fine. In that case, focus on your expertise. If you are writing a book about, I don't know, the history of airline pilots, and you are both a historian and an airline pilot, focus on that. Focus on your history accolades and your piloting accolades, because those are important. All right, our penultimate section is on marketing and promotion. I know it's annoying. You are a writer, not a marketing expert, but unfortunately, this is the way that things are. These are things that you're going to have to include. Now, this is a section that, to be fair, I have seen way more 50-50, maybe even less than 50-50. I needed it for the 3 proposals that were successful. I have not needed it for other places that I have submitted to before. So this might not be necessary, but I would still highly suggest that you think about at least some, if not all, of these aspects. Sometimes some of these elements are asked for in other spots. For example, the competing titles is definitely something that is touched on a lot, even if the rest of this section is not a requirement. So do keep it in mind, even if you are not asked for it, because somebody might ask you for it, or they might ask some of the details of this. So it's at least good to have in notes, even if not as a formalized section. The things that are going to be included in this section: audience. Again, this actually should be something that you have thought about. It should be something that you have thought about extensively. Who are you writing for? Is it middle-aged kids, like middle school-aged kids? Is it for adults? Is it for pensioners? Is it for busy parents? Is it for single people? Like, who is this for? Think about that. Also think about maybe some of the other kind of interests that might have that can cross-section. This might help with when you are promoting the stuff. Competitive and comparative titles. Again, I said it at the front of this section. I will say it again. This is something that you need to have thought of. Mostly because this is something that is typically asked. It is asked a lot. It's actually asked in fiction spaces. It's asked here. What are some comparative and competitive titles with yours? Do have answers for this. There is no such thing as, well, there's no book like mine. I know that a lot of people like to say that. A lot of people like to think that. There is something. There is something. I had, for cosplay, for example, I am the only book on cosplay that I know of that is an academic, but not in an academic press. It's not for academics. It's for the general population that is on cosplay. That is, as far as I am aware, I am the only one that existed, and I did quite a bit of research trying to find other books. There are academic books on the topic, and there are how-to books for the general populace. There is not a lot of, like, let's analyze this for the general populace. So I could easily have been like, well, there's no book like this. That's not helpful. That's not helpful. So instead, I grabbed some of the academic books. I described them, but then said, but they're for an academic audience, and mine's for a general nonfiction audience. Then I also used a how-to book as my example, and I said this is for a general audience and for cosplayers. However, it's focused on craft. It's not focused on the reasons why this matters to people. So that's something that I talked about. So these are the kinds of things that you can do, is grab from at least generally nearby. Again, for the Taylor Swift book, I don't know any book that exists that is doing what I'm doing. However, there are books about Taylor Swift. There are books about fandoms. We can cover this. So they're not saying like, I am sure there is a book that is exactly what you are doing. What they're trying to say is, where is this on the shelf? Who would buy this? If somebody bought the ideal audience that you have pictured in your head that would buy this book, what other books do they own? That's another really great way of thinking about it. What is it next to on a shelf at the library? What is it next to on a shelf in your reader's house? What other kind of books do they own? Typically, I would suggest having 3 titles for this section. Some people only ask for 1. Some people ask for 2. I haven't ever seen people ask for more than 3. And I think 3 is a pretty fair assessment of your own book. So I would suggest having 3. Publicity and promotion. Now, this one is a little bit more of an, I have seen it sometimes, but not really all that frequently. You might not necessarily need to have thought about this in great detail, but I would suggest at least having some idea. A lot of publicity and promotions of books fall on authors these days, whether that is fair or not. And to be honest, I think it's not fair. I get that this can be really difficult to think about. You don't have to have a super crazy good answer to this, but you should have thought about it. What kind of podcasts are you going to pitch yourself to, or YouTube channels or Substacks that you can guest post on? You know, just show that you've thought about it, I think, is probably your best bet. All right, last but certainly not least, this is the most important bit. I think everywhere asks for this. I have never seen a proposal not ask for this, and that is a sample chapter. So as much as you do not have to have the whole book written, you should have at least 1 chapter written. This chapter becomes your writing sample, essentially. It should be able to detail out all of the things that you are talking about. It shows that you can write. It shows that you can formulate your argument, that you are able to follow that little paragraph that you set out as your chapter breakdown. You can say, look, I followed it. It's right here. You can see it. So now you can imagine that all of the other ones will be doing the same thing. You can say, I thought about my audience. My audience are these people, and look, my writing matches the fact that I am pitching to this audience. If you said that you were writing to middle grade kids and your writing does not sound like that, that's going to be a big red flag. So these are reasons why this sample is really important. This sample chapter is almost always your first chapter. Most people expect it to be your first chapter. If it is not your first chapter, you have to have a really, really good reason as to why not. And sometimes just that alone will get it ousted. This is something that you should really spend time editing and cleaning up if you do not kind of already have an agent in your back pocket or a publisher that you are regularly working with. If this is something that you are sending out to new people, have it cleaned up. Think about it like how fiction writers need to really have a really amazing version of their book for their first one. It doesn't have to be as clean after that because they're already in. For this sample chapter, it needs to be clean, it needs to be beautiful, it needs to be perfect as you can manage it. So spend your energy really focusing on this sample chapter and the proposal to make sure it all reads really well. And that's it. That's it. That's all you need. Just all of those things. Before I leave you, I really wanted to talk a little bit about one of my proposals that hasn't really gone anywhere. To be fair, I only sent it to like a handful of places, but it didn't really get picked up by those handful of places. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I know that it's a proposal that I want to come back to eventually and review because I had some fundamental problems with some of these sections. So I thought that it would be worth talking about from kind of my own mistakes. And I made these after I had published the cosplay book. So, you know, sometimes this happens, you know, you've had a lot of really good experience. Maybe you haven't really spent time thinking about it that much. And then things don't work out and you suddenly have to really think about it. So this was the monster kind of A to Z pop culture thing that I was thinking about writing. There are a couple of problems with it. The first one, I don't think I was very clear on what it was that I was writing. Now, I know that that sounds really crazy because I was able to describe it there, but it's a lot harder to explain that in writing of like what exactly I'm imagining and how it looks and how it feels. I was able to kind of articulate the reasons why it was important and why I should be writing it. I didn't spend as much time on the why it was important because I was spending so much time trying to overly explain what this book was, and I still don't think I did a really good job. I think I managed it in maybe one section, and then it really fell apart as I kept trying to explain and explain and explain. So I would highly suggest really making sure that you do know that. And I know that, again, the what are you writing about should be something that is really nailed down, but sometimes you don't realize how you might know it in your head, but explaining it can sometimes be a bit more difficult. So that was kind of one failure that I think I had. I also don't think I was very clear on my audience. And to be honest, I still don't know. Like, I don't know who would buy that kind of book. I don't know who would be interested in it. I have had people say that they think that the idea is really cool and they would buy it, but I don't really know enough to be able to articulate why. And that means that also my writing probably wasn't as honed as I would like it to be. I definitely wrote those sample entries really different than I have written things before in the past. So, I think that that definitely also had some bearing. Where I succeeded in some of my other projects and my other proposals was that I was definitely just super clear on what I was doing. I was really clear on what I was doing. I was really clear on why it mattered to me. Like, why did I find it interesting? Why did I find it important to write? Sometimes that's a really great way of really specifying things to yourself. It wasn't as experimental of a structure as the other one is. And so I didn't really need to be super clear on all fronts. I also just pitched it to the right places. I think sometimes that's a really big thing. That's not something I can cover here, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that while there were other aspects, like I wasn't very clear on the format section for what it would look like. My entries were also picked at random. They weren't the beginning of them. I probably should have done my introduction one where I talk a bit more about the book and what it is. I should have done that as my sample, and then maybe one of the entries. So that way they get the actual writing of the book and then a little bit of one of the entries rather than two entries at random. So my sample wasn't very well chosen, I think. But ultimately what it comes down to are those three really important questions. If you really know those three questions and you really can answer them very clearly and articulately and in a variety of different ways, then all of these other elements, all of the other aspects that I listed, they obviously still have to be there, but they're not going to be as difficult to write. They're not going to be as arduous to try to get through. They're going to be a lot simpler to understand. So yeah, focus on those three questions, and hopefully this was useful for somebody. And if you want to subscribe to this channel, you can go ahead and do so, because my next vlog, which will be out a week from today, is going to be all me actually doing a proposal. I'm going to be actually writing my one for the Taylor Swift and Myth, and I'm going to be going a little bit more in detail with actual examples from that. However, I'm not going to be spending time explaining what a proposal is because I just did that. So if you want to be able to see that process, you can go ahead and subscribe. You can also check out all of the videos that I have in that Taylor Swift and Myth playlist. I have that somewhere on my channel where you can see the project as it comes together. And so some of it going from just general idea and some research kind of starting to actually putting together the chapter list and what structure it's taking form and how many pictures do I want and what kind of topics am I covering? These are all things that you have to ask yourself. So if you want to kind of see all this stuff in motion, then that's something that you can check out there. Other than that, thanks for listening to me ramble about nonfiction book proposals, and I will see you next time. Bye!